Hello everybody, how's it going today? Glowplasma 231 here, back in today to talk about Kagurabachi, chapter number 59. This chapter is titled Blackout, because, there's a sort of semi-blackout that happens in this chapter. I don't think it may have been, the best chapter title here, but it's definitely one that gets to put across one of the bigger events that happens towards the, is it midpoint or is it more towards the end? It's actually pretty much at the perfect midpoint of this chapter of Kagurabachi, and we have a really fun one this week because this chapter takes a lot of liberties, being that, okay, the big conflict with Samura is now over, of course, at the Senkutusji Temple, so now we are moving on to a point where we are past that, so we know Samura's a traitor, and we know that Iruha's dead. We actually get a full confirmation in this chapter, even though it was pretty obvious from before now, and through getting all of that, this chapter sort of lends itself to a lot more of these smaller events happening and a lot more world building of the general Kagurabachi series, seeing everything that's really going on here. So we've got a really fun chapter ahead of us, and really, I don't see any reason why we just don't need to sort of hop into this chapter of Kagurabachi itself. But of course, before we get into this chapter, let's talk about, of course, what happened last time in Kagurabachi. And of course, last chapter we had a bonus chapter, of course, all about Genshi Sojo, but really, that's not really the most important thing that we really have going on into Kagurabachi story. So as great as the last small bonus chapter, I think it was 11-page chapter was, really what's more important is the whole situation that is happening at the Senkutusji Temple. We saw that Samura and Iruha had just faced off, as Samura pretty much told Iruha his whole rationale of hey, the enchanted blades are evil devices. If I just kill everybody with an enchanted blade, then I don't need to worry about that whatsoever, right? And then we can get this war out of the way, and I'll kill all the Hishaku, and I'll then kill myself last to make sure that nobody can ever get any of these blades. And of course, the last thing that happened was Haruki, seeing all of this happening and being oh no, this is not good whatsoever, transported Chihiro using his storehouse teleportation abilities, and Chihiro just appeared on the battlefield, right as Samura just turns around and says, "Oh, Chihiro, you stink of blood." And that is where we ended last chapter of that really interesting note of, okay, we now have a reunion, of course, that was what last chapter is called, between Chihiro, if I could speak, between Chihiro and Samura. So really seeing where this goes now is the big interesting thing. But to start off this chapter of Kagurabachi, we actually have a really nice surprise, as we have a color page for Kagurabachi. Of course, being that this chapter came out at the beginning of December of 2024, it was also issue number 1 of Shonen Jump of 2025. And because of this, Kagurabachi got the magazine cover. It's not really because of anything, just Kagurabachi has been doing so well. It's hey, yeah, we'll give it a magazine cover. And the most interesting thing we get here is normally what happens is you have a page where it's either a small illustration or a colored part of the manga with the action that's going on, and then you have the color page spread, which is anything from the big event in color or just just a general color page for the manga. And surprisingly, here in this chapter, we don't have that in issue just single page. We just have a double page paid color spread. We see all of the Kagurabachi people are on it. I don't say all of them. We see that Chihiro sitting here. They're sort of on the top of a Japanese building of some type. We see that Chihiro's here cradling pretty much the enchanted blade. And we see the rest of the Makizumi, who at this point have now been eroded in their name. I guess Makizumi was not the right one, so they're now known as the Mazumi. It won't really matter since they don't come up in this chapter, but for some reason, I guess Kaoru Hokuzono did not get the name that he wanted to go across for these characters, so they are now known as the Mazumi. I'll put up a little image of something that he put up on Twitter saying, hey guys, this is what it is, hey, it's Mazumi, not Makizumi, not Mazumi, whatever, it's Mazumi, or not, it's Masumi. Masumi, not Makizumi, not anything else. But we see all of the characters sitting here. Of course, we don't have names for any of these guys, so pretty much as I've just always called them, the woman, the healer, is Violet. The bigger, other brutish guy is Scarlet. And of course, we have Mini Samura, who is just a legit Mini Samura here. But it's a really cool color page spread. We see the full moon is in the background, illuminating this whole scene. And I just really like the positions that they're all in, and like Chihiro's like sitting with one leg on top of the roof, and they are leaning down off of it. We see that mini Samura sort of just like leaning off the roof, with, like his head underneath like the roof bow. Those are all laying in very interesting ways, and I do like how Takeru Hokuzono has drawn this illustration. It's pretty neat. But to get into the chapter proper, of course, Chihiro has just appeared at Senkutusji Temple, and he stands right in front of Samura. And we see at the beginning line of this chapter is actually Samura, like, reiterating what he said last time of, "Are you sure, Chihiro? You are drenched in the smell of blood," right? As he pretty much just looks at him, or doesn't really look at him, just, like, senses him by smelling him, of course, being that Samura is, well, blind. As we see that Chihiro just gets here and just takes a look, and he says, what, Mr. Samura? And he just looks on the ground and sees Iruha and just tells like, "No, Mr. Samura killed Iruha? Like, what happened here?" And he's like, why is this happening? And then Chihiro, of course, looks over and sees Hakuri laying on the ground, and he's just freaking out constantly. As Samura just says, "Hey, Chihiro, Haruki's okay." And Chihiro's like, "Huh? Like, why should I trust you?" And Samura's like, "Hey, he's not dead. Like, don't worry about it, right?" And Samura just says, like, "Hey, don't worry about any of this, okay?" And Chihiro's like, "Hey, but this was it you?" As, of course, Chihiro thinks to hear Hiko's words from a few chapters ago where I was like, "Hey, Samura is a fraud. He said that all of the sword masters and the heroes should be protected, and, like, all of the contracted sword bearers should die." As we see that Chihiro is just freaking out over learning all of this, and he is not in a very good position, as we see, like, his eye is just, like, totally messed up in this moment. Like, he barely knows what to think about the current situation, right? As he just thinks to everything. He thinks to the Kokugoku Steam Squad, who got completely murdered. He thinks to his father, of course, when the Hishaku sorcerers came and took him out, right? And Chihiro just says, "The Hishaku killed my father. What possible reason could there be to let the Hishaku get the enchanted blades?" And Chihiro's just, like, totally breaking down. And Samura just says, "Revenge, is that what you're after? I mean, I heard the rumors at the fortress. So that's the seventh enchanted blade in your hand. Don't worry, Chihiro, I'll handle the rest. You lay down that sword, okay?" But Chihiro's just like, "No, to hell I will. Like, I am not dropping this sword. If you are an enemy, then I have to kill you too, Samura." And he's like, "I'll do it. Don't worry." But before he can really say anything else, we see that Samura takes out, of course, the Tobimune enchanted blade, unsheaves it, goes through, and cuts Chihiro right down the middle, pretty much. He cuts him on his shoulder in the exact same spot that he cut Iruha before. I guess just going to show that maybe Samura just really likes aiming for the elbows, or like just like that area of the body being. It's a little bit of an interesting observation. It's the same exact spot that he cut Iruha before. Samura just sheaths back up the sword after using, of course, the EI White Purity style, and just says, like, "Chihiro, don't worry. You don't have to do anything now. This is the problem." As he walks over and picks the N10 off of the ground. And Chihiro sees this, and he's just, like, huffing and puffing back and forth, like, like, he really can't even stand to do this. And as Samura's reaching down to pick up N10, all of a sudden, N10 and Chihiro both disappear. And we see that Mr. Shiba has come to save the day, as we see that he comes in, teleports both Chihiro and the N10 away. And we see in the moment as this teleportation happens, we see that Shiba has actually put the sheath back on N10, because as we see whenever Samura's going to pick it up off the ground, we see that, like, okay, the sheath is not on, but then whenever Shiba is holding it, the sheath is back on, and all this sort of situation. So Shiba grabs the blade and sort of teleports Chihiro away, and just says, "Hey, Chihiro, like, are you okay?" As we see that Chihiro just isn't looking good. I mean, he's got a massive, grievous wound on his chest. As we see that Samura just, like, turns around and says, "Oh, well, I see it took you long enough, Shiba." And Shiba looks over and looks down at where Samura is and just says, like, "Damn it, Iruha. So the Kumayori is already in the Hishaku hands." And Shiba's just like, "Hey, Samura, why would you do this, right?" And Samura just pretty blatantly just says, like, oh, I mean, the Hishaku already know about our sins. Like, hey, they intend to tear off the lid and bring this country down. As we get an image of the Sword Master, of course, the wielder of the Magatsumi, so it really seems like, as we're getting built up, that this wielder of the Magatsumi is not a very good guy. And, like, I remember seeing something online a while back, is like, we're going to get, like, the whole thing of this happening, and, like, oh boy, what is it, like, how is the war actually happening? And we're just going to see that, like, a part of Japan is just covered in a flower field from the Magatsumi, as, like, this wielder was just so stupidly out of control, right? But Samura eventually just says, like, hey, the curse that forever binds us as long as we continue to live as the heroes, right? And Samura just sort of continues on saying, like, hey, so I see you haven't told Chihiro about anything. He is better off not knowing at the end of the day. As Samura just says, hey, this is the end. As we see that Chihiro's eyes just sort of start to fade as, like, they're starting to close, like, he is very, very wounded. And we see that Samura ends up teleporting away and just, like, crow feathers following in his wake, as Shiba just looks on and just says, like, Chihiro! Chihiro! Just, like, trying to rally him up in this moment. As we suddenly just fade to black, and we get a little bit of an information. 2 hours later, contracted sword bears Yoji Aruha and Chihiro Rokuhira both confirmed dead. Chihiro is dead. Now, as you will see by the end of this chapter, Chihiro is not dead. He is still alive in some capacity. To what capacity? We don't quite know yet, but we see that he is alive at the end of the chapter. But this does confirm it for us that Aruha is actually dead, which is sort of just crazy, being it's like, yeah, he was introduced about 11 or 12 chapters ago, and he's gone. Like, pretty crazy thing to do, but I mean, it got the point across of what Samura's character is, so, I mean, I'm not particularly complaining. I guess I am sort of complaining, but it is sort of is what it is there. And, okay, Chihiro has died from Samura's fatal strike. Now, like I said, it really brings into question on what this whole thing is, because, like, hey, this is the problem. Like, hey, so you haven't told Chihiro, he's better off not knowing. Just really what happened back in the day, and what did all of these sword bears sort of hide, and what did they do? I mean, this is obviously something that, like, Sojo didn't know, even though he was, like, one of the people who had the enchanted blade cloud gouger. Like, what did Misaka, Aruha, Samura, the sword master, and our other two sword bears? I mean, what happened with all of them? Like, we just strictly don't know. At this point, we cut to presumably just some location where the Hishaku are sort of hanging out for now. I don't presume this would be the Hishaku's actual, like, hideout, but we really have no confirmation on where this place is, but we just see that here is where Yura, Hirohiko, and the guy I have nicknamed Talo because we don't have a name for him, he's the Hishaku member that reminds me of Best Jeanist from My Hero Academia, and sort of has, like, a bunch of laces and, like, a really big scarf up to his, or, like, a really big collar coming up past his mouth, right? A very interesting character design that we have here, right? And we see that Hirohiko is getting his arms sewn back on together, as we see this is presumably the work of Talo, who is using some sort of sorcery, as we see there's, like, some, like, talismans wrapped around his arm almost, and, like, some small things, like, trying to connect his arms together as this happens, right? And Hirohiko pretty much just is, like, explaining the situation as he saw, like, yeah, so Chihiro suddenly disappeared right before my eyes, and, I mean, just when it was getting good, too. And Talo's like, are you serious, like, getting good? You lost both arms there. I think you're particularly lucky that Chihiro got sent to Senkutusji in the end. Like, there was no telling what would have actually happened to you, Hirohiko, if he did not, right? As Hirohiko's just like, oh, well, I mean, just think about it, like, and he's just thinking, like, yeah, I mean, that's pretty much too bad, because he's thinking, like, oh, yeah, whenever I was wielding the Kumeyori, and then all of a sudden, like, I had to sheath it back up, because Chihiro just disappeared in that moment, right? As Hirohiko just says, like, hey, but Chihiro Rokuhira was really strong in many ways, as he looks over to the boss, who is, of course, Yura, right? And Hirohiko just continues, like, hey, Yura, why won't you let me wield Kumeyori? Like, I at least want to try it now, right? And we see that Yura is just like, hey, just in case, it's just all because he is coming, right? And Talo's like, here, like, you told him where we currently are? And Yura is just like, Nate, I mean, I didn't, but we're dealing with the Enchanted Blade Bear who controlled the entire war. As all of a sudden, we just get the words proclaimed, owl. As we see that Samura has used the Tobimune, and a giant owl face appears in the sky, peering down below, as we see that, of course, crow feathers are raining from the sky, as presumably this is the blackout that was mentioned earlier, as Yura and all of the Hishaku members are pretty much getting spied on, and presumably as we are sort of getting this, Samura knows exactly where they are using this sort of like surveillance technique, as it sort of seems right now, right? Yura pretty much just says like, hey, don't worry, it's just that our freedom will be cubed for a little while. As all of this happens, crow feathers fall to the ground. We see that Samura walks in the door and meets up with Yura and these other two Hishaku members in this moment. And we see that, like, Samura walks in, the enchanted blade in his hand, just says like, hey, Yura, what kind of plan was that? All of those people did not have to die there, right? And Yura just says like, hey, what was that all about? The ends justify the means. You should know this, Samura. Like, hey, we've liberated all of those enchanted blades. We depleted Haruki Sazanami. I mean, look at that. He would cause a lot of headaches if he was in good shape, and you know that, right? And Samura just says like, hey, if you have just given me the Tobimune from the start, like, this would have all turned out differently. But Yura just cuts him off and just says like, hey, you are a trump card we wanted to keep in reserve, Samura. You are a very risky move for us. I mean, some among us were resistant in involving an outsider to begin with. And Samura just is like, okay, we'll just have it your way, but you better make good on your promise. As we see that Yura just is like, I mean, of course, as long as you kill the remaining contracted sword bearers, we made a pinky promise. It is unbreakable. As we see that on both of Samura and Yura's pinkies, we see this little, like, symbol of some kind. It sort of seems like two bands that are spaced out on the last part of their pinky finger right next to the hand. And we see there seems to be like a little X drawn on it almost, which is a very interesting thing of like, okay, what is this whole pinky promise thing? Is this just like a regular sorcery that people can do to make sure promises don't get broken? Like, it's a very interesting like little world building thing of like, hey, oh, how is this working here, right? But at this point, we see that Talo just thinks to himself everything about this current situation, as Talo just thinks like, oh yeah, that's right. It was right after Kunishige Rokuhiro was killed, Yura went straight to Samura's house and made direct contact. He said that he'd helped kill the contracted sword bearers under the following conditions. Number one, Samura needed to know the identities of all 10 members of the Hishaku. And second, to reveal the identity of the Kabunagi insider who leaked Rokuhiro's location to begin with. And third, and the final stipulation, was to reveal the whereabouts of the enchanted blades at that moment. And we see that presumably Samura got all of this information because, of course, he is working with the Hishaku currently, and Yura, and all of this sort of stuff here. Yura then just certainly says, like, well, Samura, I see you've certainly gone all out, killing Chihiro Rokuhira even, which is a little bit interesting as, like, how did Yura know about this to begin with? Because I'm sure this was a news that was broadcast around, right? And Samura just says, like, hey, I didn't want to, but Chihiro's going to be getting in the way. There's no getting around that. And Yura just is like, oh, so the deep sins of the contracted sword bearers must be punished. Your conviction is quite strong, Samura. And Samura's like, well, you bet it is. I mean, we're going to get this done, however, right? But Yura then just is like, but about that. And Hiriko then suddenly, like, speaks up just as like, hey, are you telling me you killed Chihiro, old man? And Hiriko's like, hey, he and I were going to battle to the death. I had finally made a friend. I will avenge Chihiro, mister. I swear I will kill you. I swear I will kill you, right? In response to this, Samura just says like, hey, I don't know what you're freaking out about, but I know you're that little pipsqueak who is now contracted to Kumeyori, right? And we see that here he goes like, how did he know? And starts to like sniff his skin. It's like, do I smell like Kumeyori or something like that? and like just sniffs his like broken arm is like, or like the snub of his arm that was cut off earlier. And Samura just is like, hey, and to fulfill the contract after we kill the sword bears, I'll battle all of you guys to the death. As we see that Talo also thinks a little bit about this, like, hey, that's right, that is a very risky part of this contract. With this guy's help, killing the contracted sword bears is much easier, and it all depends on what happens after that. The information he gets throughout this agreement, as far as he's concerned, the purpose of this contract to him is that he gets information on all of the sword bears and every person connected to the Hishaku in order to kill us all. And Talo just thinks like, hey, in other words, he's a threat to the Hishaku too. The only reason he hasn't killed Hirohiko already is that it's just another person becomes contracted to Kumayori, it will never end, right? As we see that Samura just says like, hey, I understand you sealed up the Kumayori and isolated a blade, and hey, that's a pretty good idea. If a blade is unsealed, I can detect it no matter where its location. And don't worry, I'll be keeping an eye on you, so don't get any ideas, right? And Talo just thinks one more time like, hey, even if Hirohiko is healed up and armed with the Kumayori, could we even stand a chance against this guy? As Samura just walks back over, leaving where Hirohiko and Talo are, standing right in front of Yura, and just says like, hey, I'll kill all of the sword bears on my own, you just provide me with the information. The Kabunagi seem to have changed up their defenses, and all the fortresses have been vacated. Of course, probably talking about the Sanzo, where the enchanted sword bears were held before, right? And he says like, hey, Togoshiba was probably involved. We'll need to get a good idea of the barriers and how their forces are positioned, right? And Sarama just says like, okay, contact me. And then uses his like semi-teleportation ability as we see that he disappears using the Tobi Mune and the crow feathers just fly in his wake, right? Talo just then looks over to Yura and just says like, hey, Yura, will we actually be able to deal with him in the end? And he just says like, hey, I know it's not a great idea to play a trump card too soon, but Yura just says like, hey, it couldn't be helped, and besides, I wouldn't have played that card if it was too reckless. On the other hand, it's time to play keeps for now, as we see that Yura stands up from his chair that he was sitting at, and presumably gets ready to do something differently, right? As we just get a little bit of narration saying like, hey, one more week, and in one more week, it'll all be over. As we get a look at Samura as this happens, we don't know if this is something that Yura has planned out, like, hey, one more week, and one more week we'll have dealt with Samura, or if it's like, hey, Samura's like, hey, in 1 week we will have dealt with the Hishaku in this entire situation. We don't really quite know, all things considered, really, right? As for sure, we get a little bit of things probably from Samura, as Samura just thinks like, hey, Chihiro doesn't need to become one of us. As, of course, that's probably in reference to like, hey, Chihiro does not need to be drenched in the smell of blood and all of that sort of stuff. As we cut to some medical ward somewhere, presumably in the Kabunagi's defenses, as we see there's two surgeons who are covered in blood, and we see that Chihiro is laying on an operating table. And we see where Chihiro's wound is on his arm. We see, like, his cloak hasn't even been taken off yet. As we just see Chihiro open his eyes all of a sudden. And that is where we end this chapter of Kagurabachi. As, yeah, this was a really good chapter of the series. Chihiro is alive. There's no world in which I thought Chihiro was actually dead. I mean, I remember the one other time something like this was pulled was... spoilers for some other manga in Shonen Jump. I'm about to be mentioning Undead Unluck, so if you do not want to get spoiled on that, just click to like the outro session or just stop watching here, right? But remember that one scene in Undead Unluck where it's like, okay, after the whole spring battle, Ruin comes up and stabs Fuko through her heart pretty much, ending up killing her. And there was a whole situation of like, that was the end of the chapter. It's like, oh no, is Chihiro actually, or is Fuko actually dead? And the difference between this chapter and that chapter is here, Chihiro is just killed halfway through a chapter. I mean, not even halfway. It's like, no, it is about halfway. It's like 8 pages into the chapter, all things considered. And then we get all this other stuff, and then Chihiro seems to be alive again. It definitely seems like Samura definitely knows that Chihiro is going to be alive and maybe kill Chihiro to not have somebody like Hirohiko try to come after Chihiro again so soon. It definitely seems like while Samura is a traitor to the Kabunagi and of course to Kunoshige Rokuhira and all of the wielders of the Enchanted Blades, it doesn't seem like he is inherently truly evil. He's doing this based on his moral code, but maybe he has some love for Chihiro being that he is Rokuhira's son, and he probably still does. Samura does care for Rokuhira in the very end. A lot of just interesting things to think about here. And like I said, that moment where Fuko dies is like the next chapter. It's the whole thing of like, okay, well, let's frantically talk to Luna. Luna now exists, and it's like, okay, let's look at all of this situation here. We're going to skip a week in time and bring Fuko and Andy back when the actual Yuma ghost is added to World, so Fuko can become a ghost, right? Such an interesting thing that happened here, and I'll be interested to see what happens with Chihiro here, whether or not they just, like, sewed him back together and Chihiro is still going to be, like, fine, or we don't know. Is there, like, some cell growth sorcery that they used? There's a lot we just don't really particularly know about, but I'm sure next chapter we should get a little bit of information on this, because it's going to be like, okay, Chihiro, how did you actually end up surviving all of this? Because it's probably going to be a decently large discussion of, okay, what is actually going on here? But in the end, very good chapter of Kagurabachi. Very, very good, all things considered. Of course, we got the color page. We got all the stuff of like, okay, Shiba is now here. Samura met with Yora. We saw how all of this went down. We got a little bit of information. All of this stuff that Samura knows that we as the audience don't. He knows who all of the Hishaku are. He knows who the traitor inside the Kabunagi is. He knows all of this. And I'll be very interested to see when all of this comes up later in the series, because of course, Samura is going to be a long-term threat in the very end. But yeah, thank you guys so very much for watching this video on Kagurabachi chapter number 59. Of course, I do Kagurabachi chapter reviews on the channel, along with covering a lot of other anime and manga-related series, so if you found this video interesting, I've got plenty of other Kagurabachi chapter reviews and plenty other just manga reviews in general. I covered Oshinoko for a long time. I talked about World Trigger. A lot of more niche series, but a lot of series I just absolutely love, like Kagurabachi. But yeah, with all of that being said, thank you guys so very much for watching, and I'll catch you guys next time for Kagurabachi chapter number 60. Again, this was chapter number 59, titled, what was it called again? Blackout. And yeah, I'll catch you guys next time. Thank all of you guys for watching again, all of you Bachi bros, as we call you, and yeah, I'll catch you guys next time. This will be Glowplasma 231. Signing out.